Ellen Wilmot lived in Essex over 100 years ago, but she made a permanent mark on the Essex landscape. WARLEY Place Nature Reserve, which is just south of Brentwood. And here's a close-up of that notice board. You can see a map and a picture of Ellen Wilmot on the top right. When she last saw it, WARLEY Place didn't look like this. Instead, this was the magnificent garden she created by spending a small fortune. ALFRED Parsons painted this picture over 100 years ago, but this one was finished last week, and it was specially commissioned for tonight's event. The artist, ELSPETH MANDERS, has imaginatively recreated Ellen Wilmot's carefully manicured gardens. This is actually the left-hand side of a double panorama. So on the right, Manders conveys Wilmot's diminishing authorship of the garden as nature takes over. The daffodils and narcissus have become an amorphous foliage on the garden floor, and time has reduced the conservatory to a shell. In its heyday, WARLEY Place was in the middle of the countryside, although there was a railway station nearby, and Ellen Wilmot and her garden were famous all over the world. The visitors who came to admire it included Queen Mary, Queen Alexandra, and Princess Victoria. But when Ellen Wilmot died in 1934, she was bankrupt and developers brought up the property. The house was demolished, but luckily for Essex, planning permission for modern buildings was refused. So on the left is a 1930s housing development in Brighton, and on the right, Essex kept the row of magnificent chestnuts in WARLEY Place that had been planted in the 17th century. But after the Second World War, the garden degenerated into a wilderness, but restoration work started in 1977 and is still continuing under the Essex Wildlife Trust. And these are just a few pictures of what the nature reserve looks like today. When Ellen Wilmot arrived 150 years ago, she immediately began shaping what exists now. So she moved there with her family when she was 17 years old, and you can get some impression of what she found from this view of the conservatory shot from the wall garden. And she immediately fell in love with its 33 acres of land. She stayed here for the rest of her life. She'd been a committed gardener from a young age. She later reminisced,
"I had a passion for sowing seeds and was very proud when I found out the difference between beads and seeds and gave up sowing the former."
For her 21st birthday, her father allowed her to build an alpine rockery and an artificial gorge. He was a wealthy, indulgent solicitor who laid down only one condition: no construction noise should reach his study. This was a major project, which involved creating a ravine with a stream running through it, as well as a cave for her filmy ferns. And this picture shows the original stones, although the bridge was added later. In 1894, she hired a Swiss gardener called Jacob MAURER to cultivate her alpine garden. And this is the South Lodge where he lived for 40 years with his wife and 9 children. And as this photo suggests, she preferred a natural look to strictly cultivated flower beds. And from these paintings, you can see that her favourite plants were narcissi, and she became a world expert. She experimented on a grand scale, asking her gardeners to load up their wheelbarrows with bulbs and then let their children scatter them at random over the hillside. And the bulbs grew where they fell and then multiplied over the years. When Ellen Wilmot was in her early 30s, she inherited a large sum of money from her wealthy godmother, and she embarked on a prodigious spending campaign. She was a multi-talented woman, and she splashed out on some specialised wood-turning lathes, which are now preserved at the History of Science Museum in Oxford, 2 violins, a viola and a cello, all of them antique. One of them a Stradivarius. And she bought some cameras. This is actually a photo of Mary Pickford, but it was taken in 1916, so it shows how Wilmot might have looked using the equipment of the period. She also acquired a microscope, a telescope, and a small printing press that she used for her seed catalogues. She almost doubled the size of the gardens by buying more land, and she hired a small army of gardeners. At first, she insisted on only employing men, saying,
"Women would be a disaster in the border."
But during the war, she was forced to rely on women. The men had to work from 6 in the morning to 6 at night, and she designed a special uniform for them. A green silk tie, a boater with a green band, and a blue apron. So by 1904, the gardens included a bowling green, an alpine nursery, and a carnation house. But she didn't spend her money only on WARLEY Place, she also extended her activities abroad. She sponsored explorers such as Ernest Henry Wilson to look for plants overseas. These are photos from his expeditions to Taiwan and China, where he recruited local experts to help him find the plants that he wanted. And you can see the men at the right are loaded down with tea bricks. And this is the beautiful garden she owned in Italy near the coast. She also acquired a large estate in France. Eventually, she was forced to sell off these overseas properties because she'd been spending at an exorbitant rate. When she died, she had virtually no money left. She lived alone in her house, apart from her faithful butler, and many stories circulated about her eccentricity. For example, rather like Margaret Thatcher, people speculated about what she carried in the handbag that accompanied her everywhere. Now, I have no idea what Thatcher put in there, but I'm pretty sure that it didn't contain a loaded revolver like Ellen Wilmot's. This sounds pretty weird. On the other hand, perhaps it was a sensible precaution for a small elderly woman who lived on her own and was known to be very rich. But there's another story about her handbag, which is even less likely to be true. Supposedly, she also carried seeds of the giant prickly thistle, which she scattered in other people's gardens so that they mysteriously sprung up all over the place, although this photo is from WARLEY itself. They became known as Miss WILLMOTT'S ghosts, and that's what they're still called in the plant catalogues. But whether or not the myths about her are true, Ellen Wilmot was certainly not just a rich crank. She was a dedicated horticulturalist with a worldwide reputation. She was invited to advise on other garden projects. So, for example, she worked with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust to redesign the gardens at New Place in Stratford and at Anne Hathaway's cottage. The Royal Horticultural Society is among England's oldest and most important scientific institutions. She became a member in 1894 when she was still in her 30s, and 3 years later was one of only 2 women to be awarded a special medal to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee. She played a very active role in the society and was on several special committees, and because she was so famous, she had plenty of influential contacts, and she played a key role in acquiring the Society's current headquarters at Wisley. In 1905, she became one of the earliest women to be admitted as a Fellow of the Linnean Society. That was an enormous honour. Ellen Wilmot was a hands-on gardener with a passion for collecting as many plants as she could from all over the world. She accumulated an incredibly large number. A distinguished professional botanist, William Stearns, remarked,
"She grew some 100,000 different kinds of plants supremely well."
and a large number of them bear her name. When Ernest Henry Wilson returned from his expeditions to China and the Middle East, he expressed his gratitude by naming 3 plants after her. So there's this gorgeous blue plumbago, and there's this yellow Coreopsis, and this delicate pink rose. Because she was so famous, many other flowers were later named after her as well, but she was particularly renowned for her work on roses. She published a 2-volume handbook for horticulturalists, and these are just 3 of the 132 illustrations. After publishing this handsome book, she went on gardening and inspiring others for the next 20 years. But then she died suddenly and unexpectedly.
There is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesu. There is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesu. Alleluia, alleluia.
She's buried in Brentwood Cathedral because she and her family were devout Catholics. Ellen Wilmot's name will endure forever through the plants named after her and through the nature reserve at WARLEY Place. Now, because of lockdown, I haven't been able to visit the nature reserve myself, but when I saw the photo on the left, I was immediately reminded of medieval walled gardens and their association with the Virgin Mary, which seems a particularly appropriate link because of Ellen Wilmot's Catholicism. So all gardens are symbolically a place of refuge, a cultivated area that is demarcated from the wilderness outside. Their cultural origins lie in the Garden of Eden, but it's impossible to revert to an original state of nature. Ellen Wilmot's carefully landscaped property is now a nature reserve, but that has to be tamed and cared for just as much as a more formal garden. So, for example, these great tits are natural creatures, but they depend on human interventions to keep them alive. So, like the prickly thistles known as Miss Wilmot's ghosts, her ambitious garden design will continue to haunt WARLEY Place Nature Reserve forever.